Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. Part 2 of this series focuses on the primary ethical theories relevant to bioethics. For each ethical theory, I will begin with an overview of the theory, discuss the individuals or groups who were instrumental in developing the theory, explain how the theory responds to the three big questions of ultimate reality, human nature, and the role of God in ethics. I will end with a summary of the main points of the theory, along with what are generally considered to be the positive aspects of the theory and the limitations that the theory presents. Remember, all ethical theories that we are discussing in this course are still applied in practice today because they all contain a nugget of truth. However, all of these theories fall short of being normative for one reason or another. As you go through the theories, I encourage you to consider for yourself, what nuggets of truth do you take from the theory, and where does the theory fall short for you? In this lecture, we will look at virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a God-optional ethical theory that states in order to be ethical, you can not only do good, but you must be good and be a virtuous character. Following this lecture, you should be able to summarize the foundational components of virtue ethics, compare and contrast how Plato and Aristotle explained and described virtue, describe how virtue ethics answers the questions of ultimate reality, human nature, and God's role in ethics, explain why some ethicists believe virtue ethics should be a foundation or booster for other ethical theories, and identify two positive aspects and two potential problems with virtue ethics. In its most simplest form, virtue is a learned predisposition to act in a certain way. In other words, virtue is the development of character traits that result in good acts. Therefore, virtue does not come naturally to individuals, but must be taught or learned by a mentor or a teacher. And when we talk about virtue, we don't focus just on one individual virtue in one individual situation. We are really looking at an overall predisposition to act in good character with good acts overall in general in most situations most of the time. There are three primary virtues of human function that were identified by Plato and Aristotle. These were temperance, courage, and wisdom. Temperance is the control of physical desires, so controlling things such as appetite, controlling things such as sexual desires and urges. Courage had to do with managing your spirit and really looking at where are these choices coming from? Are you acting out of fear and out of duty? Or are you freely choosing to act in a certain manner? And then wisdom, according to Plato and Aristotle, was the highest virtue, and wisdom came from reason. Plato and Aristotle both postulated that wisdom was an elite virtue and was not achievable by the common man. Later on, justice was added to the list of virtues, and justice was described as this ability to harmonize and balance the virtues of temperance, courage, and wisdom in specific situations. Therefore, based on an understanding of virtue and the specific virtues, a virtuous act is an act that meets three objectives. according to Aristotle. For an act to be deemed virtuous, first, an individual must understand what the act is and what makes the act good. An act that somebody does out of repetition is not virtuous. The act must be a conscious choice, and it must be chosen to be done freely. The act cannot be forced, coerced, or be deemed as a duty that one does not have a choice to make. Finally, the act must proceed from a firm, unchanging character. And this is a good time to briefly discuss character versus personality. Personality are traits that we are born with, and they can be described and analyzed via different personality tests. Personality often does not develop with time, and it's very genetic and biological. Character, on the other hand, has to do with learned traits that are developed as a person grows in virtue. So therefore, the action is not part of somebody's personality, but it is part of the traits that they have developed in this attempt to be virtuous. Plato was a Greek philosopher, which many of you have probably heard of the name Plato before. And Plato taught that each person functions on 3 levels. And we kind of mentioned those 3 levels, that tolerance level with the appetite, the courage level with spirit, and then the wisdom level with reason. And he said that each of these levels corresponds to activities of the soul. And as you progress through the levels, the activities become more abstract because it's pretty concrete, your desire to eat, to have food, to have shelter. And I kind of like to think of these very loosely correlated to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And to understand virtues, Plato basically said that this was based on a non-physical perfect world called the world of forms. The world of forms is beyond the physical world that we live in. And Plato said that we are incapable of perfection, but perfection exists in this world of forms. And therefore, virtue is beyond our senses. And so he determined that acts are either virtuous to the extent that they emulate an ideal. So we may not actually reach that ideal, but we're trying to emulate that ideal. And Plato talked about virtues versus vices. And his concept was that for each virtue, there was an opposite vice. So every good act had a corresponding opposite act that was not virtuous. So like courage and cowardliness would be a really good example of that. And Plato said that the ethical life is a process of continuous growth. So it's a process of character development. And he really emphasized this learning from a mentor.
that would show you the way of a virtuous life. And Plato also indicated that we couldn't separate ethics from the other things we do, that ethics is ingrained in every action that we do.
Aristotle was another Greek philosopher, and while Aristotle is mentioned in the discussion of many ethical theories, the theory that Aristotle is responsible for is virtue ethics. Aristotle had this goal of explaining the highest good for humans, and he derived his ethical theory from physics and metaphysics. According to Aristotle, we can understand what is ethical by observing and comparing actual events. Aristotle used the term eudaimonia, or happiness, which he described as doing the right thing or being virtuous. The idea behind this definition is that when people do the right thing for the right reason, it promotes this feeling of satisfaction and contentment, or this feeling of happiness, eudaimonia. Therefore, happiness, as defined in eudaimonia, was not just a disposition, but it was the activity of doing virtuous acts. And Aristotle used these virtuous acts in eudaimonia to explain the difference between humans and animals. Aristotle said that eudaimonia only applies to humans because it goes beyond just having this feeling, but includes this aim and this desire to develop excellence in yourself. Therefore, Aristotle defined virtues as being a mean between two vices. You may have heard the term the golden mean before, and that does have to do with this mean between two vices. However, I do want to point out that Aristotle did not coin the term the golden mean. So, if you think back to Plato talked about virtues and vices as two opposite ends of the spectrum. Instead, Aristotle realized that while you could have not enough of something, you could also have too much. So, if we take the virtue of courage, Plato talked about cowardliness and courage. Aristotle, however, added that on the other side, too much courage would be considered recklessness. And so, according to Aristotle, to have an ethical life was a process of growth towards this perfect standard, towards this mean between two vices. Both Aristotle and Plato focused very heavily on the growth towards becoming virtuous over the course of your life. Aristotle specifically said that we are virtuous only when the actions we take are ingrained in who we are. And that really goes back to this whole concept of character traits and virtues being based on character and a part of our unchanging character. According to virtue ethics, truth is discovered through nature, and therefore the human character must be accommodated based on the truth that is discovered. In other words, virtues must be learned. We can discover the truth, but then we must learn how to apply it. Acts are deemed virtuous when they resemble what is ideal and what is found in nature. The nature of humans is this desire to develop our character so that we can become virtuous. Humans should not just do good, but they should be good. And again, we have to learn to do this. Humans are only virtuous, therefore, when we take a stand because we know it to be right. While God is not innately described in virtue ethics, there is room for God, and God can be included. Many Christians view this idea of seeking to be virtuous synonymous with seeking to be like God and seeking to please God. Along with the virtues that Plato and Aristotle discussed of temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice, many Christians add the theoretical virtues of faith, hope, and love to this theory. And also, in alignment with human nature of humans not just doing good, but being good, this aligns back to the Christian belief that God is more than a being who does good. God is good. According to virtue ethics, moral qualities are not part of your personality. They're a developed part of your character that must be taught either verbally or by example. And we know that virtues are right because they are rational and they are observable through nature. In virtue ethics, ethics is not separated from your daily living. Life is about the quality of your character. Being virtuous is not about how you respond in specific situations, but based on the type of person you are on the day-to-day. With regard to wisdom, both Plato and Aristotle recognized wisdom to be the highest virtue, and they were aware that most people could not obtain this highest level of virtue. So wisdom was an elitist virtue, and Plato even went so far as to say that ignorance was a moral problem. There are many today who reject virtue ethics, not because they disagree with virtues, but because they question the ability of virtue ethics to stand on its own. Some people argue that virtues should be part of any ethical theory, and that virtue ethics can be added on to any other ethical theory as a booster to further explain what these moral ethical acts are. And some say that virtue ethics fails as an ethical theory because it does not answer the question of why. Why are we being virtuous? Unlike many theories, virtue ethics very clearly delineates with this golden mean of what is right and what is wrong. However, there's no answer to why should we do right. And this concludes part 2 of our lecture series on the foundations of bioethics. In part 3 of the series, you will learn about what is often considered the ethical theory of bioethics, principlism.